maybe 10, 12 years working alongside Mike, not with Mike. He was out on the Surrey heaths creating farm and heath for the RSPB. A really intriguing fact about Mike is that he went to school with Jono over on the tech. Those of you who know Jono, was it same class?
It was the same junior school.
Same junior school. Who would have thought? Well, Jono has very kindly fished me out some photos from those days. So there we have Jono and Mike have eaten their fish and chips. Jono got a slightly earlier photo as well of the two of them. But Mike's career has been spent creating heathlands, which is, I know that most of you are going to know that. Today, in the southeast, creating heathlands is largely about taking non-native conifer plantations off land to restore it to the heathland below it. And this has been within Mike's psyche since he was a little boy. There he is. And it continued all the way through his teenage years as well. These are genuine photos, I have to say, of Mike. Now, you might think that a lifetime creating one of our most important habitats is pretty much the most exciting thing you can do in nature conservation. Would you say that, Mike? Yeah, definitely. So, in my little Googling, you know how you can go onto photo libraries today and you can find people doing things? This is genuine here. So this is a photo library where you can buy a photo of Mike should you wish to. I'm just going to pull up the caption for you. This you will find. RSPB project manager Mike Coates holding a bag. And I'm just going to finish with a slide. Most of Mike's career was spent in the Farnham area, and in Googling Mike Coates, in order to get the right Mike Coates, I was putting in Mike Coates Farnham. This isn't Mike, but I thought you'd want to see how exciting life is in the Farnham area. This is the Farnham Herald, which we had a long association with, didn't we, Mike? And this is their new season underway at the museum. I would say this is not a museum to put on your wish list. Anyway, to tell us more on this occasion about fenceless grazing, let me pass you to the wonderful Mike Coates.
Well, thank you, Adrian, I think, for that introduction. It's been really fascinating here today. You had some really good sciencey stuff this morning about cuckoos. You had Maya's really inspirational thing about the next generation of birders. And a lot of that, I'm sure, resonates with many of us, because when I first got into birds, I was pretty much a weirdo. Everybody else wanted to go and play cricket and football, and I wanted to go and look at corn buntings and that kind of stuff. Shows my age, there used to be lots of corn buntings to go and look at. As Adrian said, I've been involved in nature conservation for what I laughingly call a career for 37 years. 35 of that was on heathlands, and about 25 of that was involved with commons, and I will be coming back to commons quite a lot. I am talking about fenceless grazing, and I know that Sussex Ornithological Society did give some money to Sussex Wildlife Trust to set up a fenceless grazing scheme. I think that was at Waltham Brooks. Yep. Chris is giving me the thumbs up, so at least I got that bit right. You may have all read various press releases. You see lots of press releases. It's like, insert name of conservation organisation here, use it, trialling innovative grazing technology on such and such a site. It's not that new anymore, but I'm going to be giving you a little bit of information around fenceless grazing, and hopefully, you'll get an idea as to why, in my opinion at least, it's one of the most important technological developments for a very long time in nature conservation. So, there's a few species up there. You all know the birds. Of course you do. The butterfly in the bottom corner, that's a silver-spotted skipper. And the ugly-looking beastie down in the bottom corner, that's field cricket, Gryllus campestris. And it was actually one of those that was in the bag that you saw on Adrian's introduction. Field crickets are very much a Sussex speciality. There's only probably about 3,000 of them in the UK, and probably 2,000 of those are in Sussex. So in the same way that you guys have got the round-headed rampion as the county flower, if you wanted to have a county invertebrate, you'd go for field cricket. I was kind of involved in field cricket work for quite a bit of time with the RSPB. What have they all got in common? They all require, to a greater or lesser extent, conservation grazing. They all use habitats that need to be grazed. Now, historically, there was no such thing as conservation grazing. There was just grazing. And it either did or didn't have conservation benefit. And across large parts of certainly southern England, there would be fairly free-ranging animals. If any of you have read Colin Tubbs' New Naturalist volume on the New Forest, and if you haven't, it's a really good read. I think it's out of print now. In the early years of the 20th century, cattle from the forest would turn up in all sorts of places. They'd wander about as far as the southern suburbs of Salisbury. They'd turn up on the outskirts of Southampton. Surrey, where I spent a lot of my career, there used to be vast areas of common land with cows wandering about all over it. You could think of other places with free-ranging animals, Epping Forest, for example. But over time, people got fed up with having cows turn up on the village green. Roads got busier, and it came to be that grazing was very much associated with fencing. But fencing isn't always easy. There are lots of things that could perhaps make fencing difficult. Steep ground, rocky terrain. Has anybody here actually done any fencing? Yeah, there's a few people, yeah. It can be a bit of a pain in the backside depending on ground conditions. Soft ground actually is just as bad because blooming fence posts move as soon as you put the tension on them. Seasonality can be an issue. If you've only got a very small grazing season or a very small grazing window, it's not cost effective to put up a permanent fence, and there's a lot of issues around continually moving temporary fences around. Some areas are very important from an amenity point of view. You might not want to have a fence. Fences are ugly. This, incidentally, is not a new problem. I'm sure we've all been to places like Petworth House, Parham House, Ashburn, and whatever. Yeah, some place where an 18th century aristocrat decided to have a completely new landscape. Well, they had the same issue. They wanted to be able to sit in their pleasure garden, look out across the landscape, see the deer and the cows and the sheep wandering about, but not have them getting into the garden or, you know, rampaging through the rose beds or crapping on the croquet lawn. So they wanted something that kept the animals in, but wasn't actually visible. They came up with something called a ha-ha, which is a very, very cunningly designed ditch and bank, which does the job. Unfortunately, nature conservation organisations don't have the money to create ha-has all over the countryside. And then, of course, you've got the issue of commons. And I'm going to talk a little bit about commons, largely because commons and issues around grazing commons were one of the key drivers, certainly for the way fenceless grazing took off in the UK. Many of our best nature conservation sites, of course, are common. That's Thursley up in Surrey, my old stomping ground. But, of course, we can all think of other commons in Sussex. To get here, I drove across Cheney Common. Ebenow Common is another Sussex Wildlife Trust site. You've got the whole of the New Forest is common. You've got Ashdown Common. Further afield, Epping Forest, common. I could go on listing commons for a very, very long time, but I think it would be a very boring talk. But you get the general gist. A lot of the best sites for nature conservation in England and Wales are on commons. And fencing on commons is particularly challenging. You need the permission of the Secretary of State. Not that the Secretary of State ever actually sees the application. It's just done through the planning inspectorate. And when they're making their decision, they have to take into account what the law says is the benefit of the neighbourhood. The law concerned is, hang on, I've got to get this right, Section 38 of the Commons Act 2006, which replaced the Law of Property Act 1925, Section 193. You can tell I spent a lot of time working on commons-related issues, can't you? And they have to take into account all of the different issues around the common, not just the nature conservation value. Even on sites which are internationally important for nature conservation, our interest is just one of the many interests they have to take into account. So you've got the people that use the common, you've got the commoners who have rights over the common, irrespective of whether they actually exercise them. You've got parish councils, you've got the Access Forum, you've got the Ramblers Association, the British Horse Society. All of these bodies all need to be consulted with, and their interests need to be taken into account before a decision can be made to give permission to actually put up a normal fence on a common. And often these decisions are incredibly unpopular, simply because the unfenced nature of common land is, for many people, part of their appeal. The Open Spaces Society, anybody here a member of the Open Spaces Society? Okay, that's good, I haven't been polite, that's fine. The Open Spaces Society portrays itself, likes to call itself, one of our earliest nature conservation organisations. It was set up back in 1865, and it was set up quite specifically to prevent enclosure, i.e. to stop people putting fences up on commons. And they are a statutory consultee. So all applications to fence common have to go past an organisation whose very raison d'etre is to stop fences on commons. Not surprisingly, with the way this is set up, there has been a very long and contentious history when it comes to fencing applications on commons. Wouldn't it be nice if there was a system that meant you could keep animals in without fences? Interesting thought. This whole issue became incredibly contentious in the 1990s and 2000s, which is when I was sort of cutting my teeth and getting really stuck into heathland and conservation work. I love that quote. Heathland madness! Brilliant. The juggernaut of nature conservation. A lot of people really hated what we were looking to do, what conservationists were looking to do across commons. As I say, the 1990s, early 2000s, numerous applications, because money was available, thanks to Heritage Lottery Fund and the Tomorrow's Heathland Heritage, and also agri-environment. And so large numbers of schemes were suddenly proposed, all across the country, from Cornwall up to Caithness, all over the place. Many generated very significant local opposition. The grazing wars quote, again, it's all taken from this fantastic website, it's more of a kind of a blog called Self-Willed Land. I used to read it all the time because it was really good for getting the blood pressure up. They were definitely not a fan of grazing, or indeed heathland, or indeed conservation management. They were very much of the leave it all alone and everything will be perfect school of thought. The way the law is set up, if there is a lot of opposition, then the planning inspector is obliged to call for a public inquiry into a fencing application. That can be ludicrously expensive. And during this period, there were lots of public inquiries. Ashdown Forest, that one went well. There was consent for the roadside fencing at Ashdown. Odium Common at Hampshire, that one did not go well. That proposal was rejected. I've got Chobham and Steadham up there because those two inquiries were both running on at roughly the same time. I think the decisions were made within about 3 months of each other. Exactly the same arguments were made on both sides. In some cases, they were made by exactly the same witnesses, because you had people who appeared before the inspector at both inquiries, and you got totally different results. So, at the Chobham inquiry, the inspector accepted the nature conservation value of the site and the importance of grazing from a nature conservation point of view, but felt that the amenity and aesthetic impact of the fence would override that, so it was rejected. At Stedham, exactly the same arguments, as I say, in some cases the same cast of character, but the inspector said, no, nature conservation wins on this one. There was no consistency. It was a bit of a lottery as to which way it was going to go. Wouldn't it be nice if you could have a system that kept cows in without requiring fences? You know, and all of that aggro put a lot of people off even going for application. I was involved at the time, I was working for a local authority, and Muggins here came up with a scheme to put up a fence around a bit of heathland. I think it would be fair to say that the smelly brown substance hit the big worry thing in a very large way. And the local authority basically backed down. And there were lots of occasions where landowners and managing bodies just flung their hands up and thought, no, this is all too difficult, all too complicated. We can't actually run this at all. I hate the pun, common purpose, but nevertheless, beginning in 2005, Natural England, English Nature, as it was that week, I lose track of what it's called, and the Open Spaces Society tried to work towards a compromise. There were a lot of discussions over sort of a 5-year period, and they came out with a kind of a live and let live kind of agreement, a concordat, if you would like. OSS said that they would not formally object if the area to be enclosed was 10 hectares or 10% of the total area of the common, whichever was smaller, so that was big of them. And if the applicant followed an agreed public consultation process before applying to the Secretary of State, well then, again, OSS would not object. However, others could still object. So any application for fencing common land, even after this, there is still a risk of very expensive and awkward public inquiry, as it says up there. Following that agreed process is also time-consuming and very costly, because it tends to be a two-stage process. So first of all, you have to identify all of your stakeholders and all of your consultees, and that can be a problem. Then you have to produce a kind of an information pack which goes out to them. Normally you have a drop-in day or two so they can come and shout at you. The first stage is just to assess whether the feeling is that grazing is an appropriate management method for the site, which from a nature conservation point of view is always a bit of a no-brainer, but you have to put that information out there. And then you have a second phase where you produce a new information pack setting out exactly what your proposals are, where you want to put fences, where you want to put gates, and then that goes back out to the stakeholders. There's more drop-in days, there's more being shouted at. Again, wouldn't it be nice if there was a way of keeping cows in without having to go through all that? Oh, I've gone backwards. Let's go the right way. There we go. And we thought we had one. But it turned out to be a little bit of a false dawn. That was a thing called a Beauregard system, which relied on a buried cable. And the idea was, cable buried acts as a sort of radio transmitter. The cows wear a collar. As they approach the buried cable, they get a warning signal. If they ignore that and carry on, then they get a little electric shock, which persuades them to turn around and go back in. The shock, by the way, is very minor. It is much less than you would get from just touching an ordinary electric fence. It does work, but it's limited to 2 kilometres of wire. I mean, not 2 kilometres, that's a lot. Not really, it's a square 500 metres by 500 metres, 25 hectares, tops. There was a workaround. You could arrange your buried cable so it was like a long, thin sausage, and then you can have another long, thin sausage next to that, and another long, thin sausage next to that, and another one, and make a much bigger enclosure. Each of those loops had to have its own battery housing, had to have its own box of electrics. Major problems if the cable broke, because it wasn't always easy to find the break. You could spend a lot of time trying to dig up the right bit of cable. Where you had a cable joint, water got in. And the thing that I really disliked about this system was that if, for example, an animal got chased out by somebody's dog, that's not an if, that's a when somebody's animal got chased out by a dog, if they tried to get back, when things had all calmed down and they'd settled down a bit, they'd try to get back to rejoin the group, but they'd get an electric shock, so they wouldn't want to. So then you'd have to go and actually shut the whole system down and hope that in the time it took you to get the escapee back in, the others hadn't all made it for free. So, despite the limitations, this system was used quite widely by early adapters, notably Corporation of the City of London, who used it a lot at Epping Forest and at Burnham Beaches, and a few other places. I think I had it at Cromston Common up in Surrey as well. And Surrey Wildlife Trust also put a bit of money into this. This system used AM radio. They did try and develop a system that used an FM radio signal, which would have had the advantage of enabling you to have much bigger loops. And I have to confess, for the first time in my life, I was a bit of an early adopter, and I persuaded the RSPB to put in an FM loop on one of the reserves I was looking at. In fairness, we did need to do it in order to meet some funder fulfilment requirements, but there was a very slight problem with the FM system. It didn't work. It just didn't give the cattle a big enough belt. They just sort of ignored it. Thought, what's that? And just carried on. So yeah, that was about 8,500 of the RSPB's money I wasted. Sorry, Jono, I know you raised the funds. Sorry, Chris. Anyway, moving swiftly on. The new system is, I think, absolutely revolutionary. It's a Norwegian system. It's called no fence. The clue is in the name. It works with a GPS collar and an app. I love the fact it works with an app, because it means you can do an awful lot of stuff with it from the comfort of your own armchair, with a nice mug of tea. You haven't actually got to be outside in the rain or any of that stuff. So you can set the boundary of your grazing compartment, as I said, from the armchair, with a nice mug of tea on the app. Works the same as the berry cable system. As the cows get closer, gets a warning sound. As they get closer still, it changes pitch so they know something's coming. And then if they continue, they get a very small electric shock. As I say, smaller than you'd get from just touching a conventional electric fence. All of these systems relied on animals being trained. You couldn't just get a cow, stick a collar on it and chuck it out. You could, but it probably wouldn't end very well. So you needed to train them. So you need to have a field somewhere where you could give them a bit of training so that they knew what the signal meant. With most cows, it probably only takes 2 or 3 days, but the manufacturers recommend training them for a week to 2 weeks. There we go. The advantages of this system is a GPS collar, so you know where the cows are. You can just call it up on the app. You get a map and it tells you where every single cow is. Now, anybody here done some lookery, volunteered to keep an eye on livestock on a conservation site? No one. Very wise. Ah, somebody has. Yeah, somebody else at the back. The most important thing is trying to find the ruddy things. You know, particularly because conservation grazing tends to be at relatively low densities. Very often the enclosure has got scrub, gorse, whatever. The blooming things like to spend a lot of their time lying down in the vegetation, and believe me, it's quite easy to lose quite a large cow in tall grass. None of that. You know, I have spent hours, literally, wandering grazing enclosures, trying to find them. With this, you get a map, and they're on it, and you can just walk there, and boom, there they are. The same app will send you a message. If one of the cows hasn't moved for 3 hours, it sends you a message. And then you can think, oh, I better go out and find what's happened. It might be dead. It might be stuck in a bog. Or it might have managed to lose its collar, which is why the collar hasn't moved anywhere for 3 hours. But it lets you know there are no unpleasant surprises. Brilliantly, if an animal gets out and then decides it wants to go back and rejoin the herd, it doesn't get a shock on the way back because the GPS system knows exactly where it is and which way it's heading. So there's no issues. There's no battery cabinets, there's no batteries, nothing to maintain. In the case of the leisure batteries that you needed for the old Berry cable system, they used to get nicked on a regular basis. There's a good market for leisure batteries. There are no batteries. Brilliantly, you can set up exclosures within your enclosure. So you can set up your paddock, and if there's a bit where you don't want them to go, you can just create that on the app, while sat in your armchair, with that nice cup of tea that I mentioned before. And it gives you data. It gives you data about how often each collar has been triggered, so you can work out, well, is this a problem with the collar, or have I just got a particularly stupid or a particularly bold cow? And if you've got an animal that keeps getting shocks, you're probably better off taking it off-site because it's clearly not enjoying the system. But it tells you, you've got the information there. A feature that I particularly liked, which I haven't mentioned there, is it generates heat maps. So you can see which bits of the site are being most heavily grazed, which are the bits where they really like to go, which are the bits where they really don't like to go. And then you can make a decision. Okay, am I happy with that? Or do I really want to kind of push them into one of those areas that they're currently not using much? And you can do that because you can just change the boundary from your armchair with a very nice cup of tea. It's really a brilliant system. And no offence, I'm not paying me to say this, by the way, folks. But perhaps I should get in touch with them about that. Anyway, the other thing is it's got a solar panel on each collar to charge the battery. And they've been working on batteries over the years, and they now say that a single charge should, and I do stress should, last for an entire grazing season. That's 9 months, which is brilliant, because obviously having to round the animal up to change batteries is quite stressful on the animals, and you want to try and minimise stress wherever you can. Grazed by sheep rather than cattle. No fence has produced collars that work for sheep and goats. In fact, it was originally invented for goats in Norway. Goats can be a bit of a problem in terms of keeping them in. They are escapologists. There is, when I first started working for the RSPB, I had a line manager, a really lovely man called Martin, and he was telling me horror stories of how he used to have pig and goats on one of the reserves that he looked after, and they ended up on a dual carriageway out just on the outskirts of Tunbridge Wells. Did he ever tell you that story, Chris? Or did he avoid that? He might not have mentioned that to his boss. I don't know why. But goats are a problem to keep in. But this system actually works with goats as well, which is fantastic. In fact, and this is slightly irrelevant, but in Norway, the no-fence people have got contracts to graze underneath a lot of the power lines there, just to keep the vegetation down. So we don't have to have gangs of people going in and cutting everything down. It's all done with goats and collars and apps. So again, the Norwegians are doing that from the comfort of their armchair, but probably with a cup of coffee. They prefer coffee. It's also good from a people point of view. One of the things that conservationists need to accept is that a lot of people are very wary about walking through enclosures with livestock. Some people are genuinely convinced that cattle do spend their lives hunting down Jack Russells and eating them. That's nonsense. They can't eat anything bigger than a chihuahua. But this generates a QR code. And you can print that off, put it on a poster, put them up all the way around your site. Anxious members of the public can just scan the QR code, and it gives them temporary access to the map function of the app. They can't amend it or edit it, thank heavens, but they can just see where the animals are. So they know exactly where the animals are. Also has a nice blue dot so they know where they are, and they can just choose to walk through and avoid the animals. It's incredibly reassuring for nervous members of the public that they are not going to turn the corner and suddenly bump into a herd of rampaging livestock. If you are a volunteer looker, you can also use this. You can just turn up, scan the QR code, it'll tell you exactly where the animals are, you can go and find them, and you can go home and have a nice cup of tea in your armchair. And you haven't got to actually have hundreds of people all with subscriptions to the app. It's really quite a good system. It's not perfect. They've not worked out how to make it work with horses. Horses are dumb. They react in a very different way, both to the signal and to the shock. A horse that gets a shock is every bit as likely to just take off at high speed in the same direction rather than turn round in the way that a cow will. So they've not made it work for horses, and there is a problem from a conservation grazing point of view, because a lot of organisations prefer to use horses because there's less paperwork involved. There's a lot less paperwork and bureaucracy involved and movement records required when you're dealing with horses rather than cattle, simply because, Finder's crispy pancakes aside, horses rarely end up in the human food chain, at least in Britain. So, this system's brilliant. So who's using it? Well, really, it's a case of who isn't. It's widely employed by just about every nature conservation organisation. RSPB are using it. They're using it on upland sites of Haweswater. They're using it on lowland heath in Paisley, which is where I came across it. It's being used on wet grassland of Wallasey. Wildlife trusts all over the country are using it. I've already mentioned the fact that Sussex Wildlife Trust is using it thanks to the generosity of Sussex Ornithological Society out in Brooks. I think they're also using it at Ebano. Is that right, Chris? Yeah. It's being used on Ashdown, it's being used at Seven Sisters. Corporation and City of London are all over it, particularly Epping, Burnham Beaches. National Trust are using it. You know it's a system that's got a lot of appeal because it's being used by commercial farmers as well as part of mob or strip grazing, because it saves an awful lot of messing about with electric fencing. Because again, they can just shift the boundaries and move the animals around from the comfort of their armchair with a nice cup of tea. It's far and away a brilliant system. That, I think, will have long-term advantages for nature conservation grazing, simply because, particularly in the southeast, it's really hard to find people who own livestock that are prepared to put them out. So if you've got a pool of livestock owners who are familiar with the technology and who are comfortable and relaxed with the technology, it may make it a little bit easier to find conservation graziers in the future. Fingers crossed, because that is certainly one of the main challenges. Now, I know from my 37 years that conservation as an industry can be a bit conservative and it can be a little bit risk averse. It is true that the risk appetite of organisations does vary, but by and large, it can be very risk averse. It's incredibly rare, therefore, for a piece of kit, piece of technology like this to be so widely adopted so quickly, and I think that just goes to show that there was a huge kind of pent-up demand for this. It gets rid of a lot of that aggro that we used to have around fencing on commons. It doesn't totally eliminate the need for fencing, because I think most people would be reluctant to rely exclusively on this, so there's still perhaps a need for roadside fencing. But who knows? There's a lot of confidence about this system. I mean, the site I worked on, the first year we had literally just one escape, 14 animals for 9 months. Wasn't supposed to be 9 months. They were all supposed to be off by the end of October, but our grazing was useless, so they were still there at Christmas. But in that period, there was just one escape, and that just turned around and walked back in. No problems at all. You can't use it on very young animals, partly because they don't make the collar small enough, but also because as they're growing, you're constantly having to bring them in and adjust the collar, and that's just stressful. So we had an experience on one of the sites that I used to work on. Had some very young, had some cows with calves. Didn't put collars on the calves, working on the assumption that they're going to stay with their mum. And they did, to start with. But then, as they got a bit older, and they got a bit more confident, they decided to go for a little bit of a wander, and then, of course, having seen the youngsters going for a bit of a wander, their mums braved the shock and went after them. So we had a few off for a little while. And it was sod's law. There was one neighbour of that site who had vigorously opposed any conservation grazing. In fact, they vigorously opposed the RSPB buying the land in the first place. They vigorously opposed us removing any of the trees. Point of fact, they really didn't like the RSPB at all. And guess whose farmyard the animals ended up in? Yeah. So it's not good for very young animals. But you can learn from that. The system is very, very effective. It was a real game changer. It has genuinely been one of the most exciting developments in conservation land management that I've certainly been aware of, as I say, in 37 years. It has been brilliant, and the fact that it has been seized on with such alacrity by so many organisations, it just goes to show how important it is and how vital it is as a way of getting that conservation grazing in action. Because there's lots of things that will benefit from decent conservation grazing. Again, yeah, you know the birdie ones, black-winged and golden plover chick. The butterflies there are chalk-gill blue and grayling in the top corner, and the plants, oh dear, the plants. Yeah, it's the sundew, but I'm thinking of the club moss. It's marsh club moss. These are all things very much associated with conservation grazing. They are all things that will benefit from the wider use of no-fence or fenceless grazing systems. Other fenceless grazing systems are available. There is a Spanish firm that also produces it, though I don't know of anybody in the UK that is using the Spanish system at the moment. Right, that is it. So, thank you for listening. Any questions? Please don't ask me anything particularly technical about the system. Firstly, because I think it might bore some other people here, but secondly, very importantly, I don't know it. So if you have any more technical questions, just check the No Fence website.
Outside the box, is the potential to use this system to protect an area of ground that's been birds from dogs?
Okay, so the question is there the potential to use this for ground nesting birds?
Correct your dog collar here.
Collaring your dogs.
Yeah, the whole issue of dogs and ground nesting birds, I think there's probably at least another conference in that one. And also, yeah, quite a lot of blood pressure, and I definitely need a stiff gym when I've been talking about that subject. Funnily enough, there are fenceless grazing systems that are set up specifically for dogs. You can get a system that you can put up in your garden that stops your dog, or Amongst the cats as well. But okay, the problem would be, how do you compel people to put collars on? That would be tricky.
Any more questions for Mike? Yes, in the middle there.
I would say a 5-year period, how would the cost compare with erecting and maintaining fencing versus the no fencing?
Okay, so the question is, how does the cost compare with putting up an actual fence?
The obvious answer to that question is it depends. Conventional fencing, £7 a metre. Gets really unfortunate if you've got lots of gates. If you've got to put cattle grids in, I mean, on one of our schemes, we needed to put in 3 cattle grids, 15 gates. There's only about 2 kilometres of fencing, but because of the grids and all the gates, that cost us 60,000. The no fence system is £250 per collar, and then the subscription to the app is £5 per month per collar. So it is actually cheap by comparison. But obviously, if you've got a nice straightforward fencing job that doesn't involve any cattle grids, doesn't involve hundreds of very complicated self-closing gates, then the relative cost of the fencing project is very different. But it is actually a very cost-effective system.
Yes.
How long does this system actually have in reserve or being used? It sounds like it's been going for years from what you've been saying.
So when did this system start?
In the UK, it's relatively recent. Again, the early adopters, people like Corporation of the City of London, they started moving over to this system probably about 2017, 2018, something like that. But it hasn't been around for very long. And that's why I think it's quite notable that it has been adopted by so many people. There was a huge pent-up demand for a system that let us keep cows in without any of the aggro that was associated with fencing on publicly accessible sites. But it's a relatively recent system. Yeah.
Yes.
You mentioned that we're still probably common zones on roads.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that going to change as people get more confident in using it?
So at the moment, you still have fencing where there are roads. Is that situation likely to change as people become more confident in the no-fence system?
Yes is the short answer to that question. Obviously, it depends on how busy the road is, but I am aware that at Burnham Beaches, the Corporation of the City of London are actually they're not bothering even with cattle grids on minor roads, they're just relying on the no-fence. So as people become more confident, where there are minor roads, I think you will see people just sticking to no-fence. But I think if it's a busy road, I mean, the site I was working on up in Hampshire, it's a ludicrously busy road, so it would be difficult.
We're up to Barry.
Could it replace the need for daily lookering?
Could it replace the need for daily lookering, this going out and checking where the cows are?
Unfortunately not, because you've still got to actually check on them. It doesn't tell you exactly what their condition is. It will tell you where they are, and it will tell you if one of them hasn't moved for 3 hours. But between being dead and just being hidden, there's a whole sort of spectrum of things. So you do still need to go out and do the lookering. But it just makes it a heck of a lot easier because you can find them.
Do you have or have there been problems encountered with the nexus itself being hung up or breaking away? And sorry, the second part, which might be going on 10 years, something without a collar, but it achieves a micro version of the same system would be less clumsy to use.
So, double question. First one is, have there been any problems with the collar physically getting caught? And secondly, might there be a technological solution down the line which uses something smaller? I don't know. Okay, Martin.
To answer the first point, that is obviously a concern, because what you don't want is the collar getting snagged and the animal being trapped. So the collars are actually designed so they will snap. If the animal gets caught on a branch or whatever, the collar will break. So that's a very important point from an animal welfare point of view. Which is why I say sometimes when the collar hasn't moved for 3 hours, it's not because the animal's in trouble, it's just because the collar's snapped. In terms of whether they're going to be able to get something smaller and neater and less clunky, because it weighs a couple of kilos with the battery and everything. It's not a problem for a cow, they're big, robust animals. But the smaller and lighter you can make it, probably the better. But that's, as I say, that's way outside my comfort zone, trying to give an answer on that.
Maybe fine.
No fence, sheep and dogs, how that will work?
No fence sheep and dogs, how will that work?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Obviously, once the dogs, somewhere like Ashdown, when there are dogs wandering about inside the roadside fences, you've still got the same issue. At the end of the day, oh dear, I just said at the end of the day. Next thing I'll be saying is, going forward, please shoot me now. But the bottom line, that's another one. There is no technology that will eliminate either stupidity or irresponsibility on the part of human beings. And there is, well, I suppose there's a bully, but probably a bit excessive even for the nature conservationists.
So what I'm trying to clarify is, so this will work for the sheep going outwards, but obviously there's nothing to stop anything going into the animals.
No, there isn't anything that will stop, because the whole point of the system is that there isn't a physical barrier there, and that's what gets around or helps you to minimise the legal problems on commons. There is no physical barrier, so you're right, there's nothing to stop anything from getting in.
They're not going to feel the shock either.
What's that?
Animals going in aren't going to get the shock if they
No.
don't have the collar.
No, if they're not wearing a collar, they don't get any shock at all, and even if it's an animal, even if it is one of the sheep, on the way back in, it won't get the shock.
Tim.
I'll ask everyone else a question. I'm interested to hear that you said that private landowners are taking up the no fence collars and grazing.
Yeah.
We found that getting funding for collars is quite difficult because DEFRA can't get it from the agriculture.
So a question about where to get the funding for them.
Yeah, the picture on that is confusing because originally you could. It was funded through HLS, and then they changed it because people had raised animal welfare concerns, and then for a period you couldn't get any funding through agri-environment. Then they changed it so you could get funding for agri-environment. It does kind of change with the weather. But at the moment, I think there is funding available. I can think of at least one site. I think it's the Shropshire. No, it's one of the national landscapes, and the national landscapes are funding fenceless grazing through the Farming in Protected Landscapes scheme. So FIPL were giving money, which is the same. It's still DEFRA. So if DEFRA are giving money through FIPL, they probably this week are still giving money through agri-environment. But that does involve that two sides of DEFRA do actually talk to each other. Okay, I'm not going to say anything else at that point.
Do we have any final questions? Yes.
You mentioned the problem with horses, but you didn't mention pigs in either category.
Okay, pigs. What's the issue with pigs?
It hasn't been tried with pigs. I suspect it probably won't work with them. but to the best of my knowledge, it hasn't been tried with pigs. Pigs are still very niche, is the best way to put it, in terms of conservation grazing. I can certainly think of some sites in Dorset that are using them, and there are a few other sites where pigs are being used. But to the best of my knowledge, there hasn't been any work done to see whether they would be suitable. It's an interesting one. Watch this space. It'll be quite interesting to see if they can find a collar that works for pigs.
Would you like to try it with people?
Yeah, I would like to try it with people, but they wouldn't be. It would be a case of something to keep them out rather than.
Yeah, I'll take my next question.
We do this no fence technology on the
Yeah.
big population pigs. They don't have any necks.
If you didn't hear that, the gentleman has got no fence working on the estate, but pigs don't have necks, which is a problem.
Yeah.
They also react in a similar way to horses. They get shot from
They have.
straight at them.
And they bolt like horses do. Okay.
There we go.
Lovely. Right, brilliant. Thank you very much for all your questions here. There's a little theme from today, which is the technology that's at work for conservation, and also there's also an interesting theme, which is how much grazing is important for nature conservation. I'm sure that many people out there have no idea how important this is as a topic to save the birds that we're trying to save. Really fascinating talk. If you could give your thanks to Mike. So we're scheduled for a little mini break here. We normally put